So just by way of a very quick introduction to the kind of aims and objectives of this particular session, we've heard at various points during the day about the way in which dominant kind of both global and national political, policy and media narratives about migration and migrants are often very negative. They lack nuance, they're often unevidenced, and they're often exclusive of migrant voices. These narratives reflect and reinforce racism and xenophobia and intersecting forms of discrimination that we've been hearing about. And they have harmful material consequences for migrants who may already find themselves in precarious situations. So they're manifested in violations of migrants' human rights, including a lack of access to basic services such as health, education, and of course justice. They're manifested in discrimination in employment, occupational segregation of migrant workers, lower remuneration, and they're manifested also in the day-to-day lived experiences of migrants and other ethnic minorities who find themselves subject to various forms of racism and xenophobia. What they also do is they narrow the political space for more progressive policy responses. And those policy responses that we've been hearing today can both contribute to development, but they also are about human potential and improve outcomes for migrants themselves. So you won't be surprised to learn that narrative change is one of MIDEQ's 3 impact pathways. We have a theory of change with 3 impact pathways, one of which is building academic capacity, particularly in the Global South. One is around improving migrants' lives and that of their families and communities. And one is in relation to narrative change. And we're interested in 3 different things. First of all, we're interested in understanding the form that migration narratives take in different countries and contexts and the consequences of that for migrants. These forms almost always reflect a particular configuration of historical and political factors. They also speak to other kinds of issues in the country, often serving to either distract from particular issues or attaching the impacts of migration to certain areas that, if you like, have greatest political traction for those that wish to use them. And we'll hear a lot more about this today in the panel from both Burkina Faso and in relation to the experience of Haitians in Brazil. The second reason why narrative change is important is that we want to understand what kinds of narrative themes and strategies might be relevant to different groups in different kinds of contexts. It's not the case that the kinds of tools that we employ to create narrative change are necessarily of equal relevance or pertinence in each place that we work in. So thinking here of MIDEQ work in different contexts, we have an upcoming regional workshop in Malaysia and an exhibition of photography entitled A Little Bit Like Home, Nepali Migrant Workers Placemaking in Malaysia. We've heard earlier today about a beautiful book on migration and love written by an Ethiopian migrant who was detained in Tanzania and facilitated by our team in Ethiopia. The China team is writing a book about the experiences of Chinese gold miners in Ghana. The South Africa team is bringing together different communities, Ethiopian and South African, other nationalities, to sing songs, the same songs in various languages. So you'll see there's a lot of different ways in which we might engage different parts of the community in constructing different kinds of narratives. But I think the third point, and the one that we'll also be talking about today, is around the kinds of narratives that we want to create. So it's one thing being critical of dominant narratives and wanting there to be a counter-narrative, but what does that counter-narrative look like? How do we balance the representation of migrants as potential victims of discrimination and exploitation, whilst also reflecting their agency and humanity? And this speaks very much to the points that Hearns was making in his keynote earlier today. So it's a very complicated and nuanced topic, but fortunately we have some excellent speakers who are going to help us to navigate it. And they're going to focus on the questions that you'll have seen in the program. We also have an excellent discussant, a powerful advocate for refugee rights, to reflect on the issues of racism, xenophobia, and migration narratives and share his own experience of how to mobilize for refugee rights and how to challenge these racist and xenophobic narratives. And we have Baindu from MIDEQ, who is going to act as our rapporteur, help gather up the online questions and catch anything that we might have missed. So we will have time for questions and comments, both in the room and online. And if you're joining us online, thank you for sticking with us, or welcome if you've joined us a little later because of the time zones. Please write your questions, your comments in the Q&A box, and we, or more specifically, Baindu, will collate them. So that's what we plan to do. And as I say, we are tight on time, but we still have plenty of time. So we just need to manage that well. So let's start. Let's start first by turning to my dear colleague, Tabika Alexandra Tapsoba. Alexandra is a lecturer and researcher at ISSP in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. She has a background in economics, but as with many of the researchers in MIDEQ, I've kind of forgotten that because I think, Alex, you've become a very interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary scholar as by virtue of your experience in the MIDEQ project. So I've got a kind of question for you, and really that's a question about the ways in which racism and xenophobia undermine the potential of South-South migration to contribute to development, and also the kind of experiences of migrants and their families. And we're very much looking forward to your contribution. Thank you.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you, Katja, and thank you, IOM as well. Thank you, Heaven, for inviting me to speak at this panel. So I'm Alexandra Tapsoba, as she said, and I'm working on the corridor Burkina Faso-Côte d'Ivoire, as along with my colleagues in Ouagadougou and Abidjan. And we do not, in the MIDEQ, we do not have a specific work package on xenophobia. We are working on inequalities and poverty, on children, and also on financial flows and flows of ideas. However, in our methodology, is the same methodology as Haiti and Ghana. We used mixed method, so we had a survey with 3,841 households, and we have also interview guidelines. So you will see in my presentation that we have some questions in the survey that helped us answer some of the questions regarding xenophobia, but the main answers are coming from the qualitative fieldwork. So to begin, okay, perfect. So I wanted to give a little bit of context of the migration between the two countries. And I wanted to highlight here that the two countries are very much linked geographically. As you can see, we share a border on the southern part of Burkina Faso. We are also historically linked because the two countries are former French colonies, and also we are linked culturally because we share the same ethnic groups on both sides of the corridor, on both sides of the border. So I just mentioned here the Birifor and the Senufo. And for the Birifor, for example, when there's initiation ceremonies in Africa, like what happened in Africa sometimes, you'll see that Birifor from the other side of the border would travel to Burkina Faso for the initiation ceremony. So for these people, these borders are essentially imaginary because they don't really see it as different communities. So we are also linked historically because in 1932, the Upper Volta, that was the name of Burkina Faso at the time, was dismantled and shared among neighboring colonies. The idea and the majority of the colony was attached to Côte d'Ivoire. The idea of the French at the time was that the Haute Volta or Burkina Faso is too much populated given the climatic conditions. So they figured this many people, we should encourage them to move towards where it is more easy to practice agriculture. So as I'm saying, so the main idea was to stimulate labor migration towards the major colonial enterprises like cocoa plantation and railway constructions. So the colony of Burkina Faso was reconstituted in 1947, but these 15 years shaped considerably the migration history of the country. Because when you see all censuses in Burkina Faso, we see that Côte d'Ivoire is the main destination of migrants. So the latest census in 2019, we found that 61.1% of the migrants have Côte d'Ivoire as the first destination, but this share is very much decreasing over time as people are migrating further in Gabon, for example, or in Equatorial Guinea. So Côte d'Ivoire is still the main destination of Burkinabe migrants. And regarding the important topic we are talking about here, the xenophobia, given the context, you can see that the two countries are very much linked and population are very much linked, and some of them don't really do the difference between the borders, and especially because we are the same country basically for 15 years. However, some important events actually happened in the Côte d'Ivoire and affected the Burkinabe people there. So violence against Burkinabe in Côte d'Ivoire rose with land laws and political tensions. So with the political evolution in Côte d'Ivoire, you will have land laws that will prevent foreigners, for example, to own some lands. So, but at the time, a lot of Burkinabe bought land in Côte d'Ivoire, and these new laws are basically saying you cannot own the land. So you have this tension and also political tensions. So I'm talking about here the taboo conflicts in 1999, where 70,000 Burkinabe, among which 75 to 80% children and women were repatriated in Burkina Faso, according to the National Emergency Relief and Rehabilitation Council. In 2001, there were 80,000 Burkinabe, and in 2002, there was a coup attempt in Côte d'Ivoire, and the Prime Minister gave these following numbers, like 42 assassinations, 25 disappearances, and a lot happened basically. I'm just giving some of the numbers that was given at the time of what happened to Burkinabe in Côte d'Ivoire. So in 2003, exactions continued, with Burkina being accused of being part of the political tension that divided the country. So we assisted to destruction of the consular offices of Bouaké, Soubré, and Abidjan, regions where there were a lot of Burkinabe at the time in January 2003. And also, I'm mentioning here the concept of ivoirité or ivoirity, what is meant to be an Ivorian, basically. This is a concept that has been developed and theorized by intellectuals and was not at the time originally intended to be xenophobic, but given the tension, the ongoing tensions at the time, this exacerbated, and also the circumstances and goal at the moment, basically at the time it was to prevent certain politicians to come in power. And this man is actually the president now, so that doesn't really work. But anyway, Côte d'Ivoire at the time was basically divided in two. You have the north and the south, and you have the north. You know, remember what I was saying at the beginning, that a lot of the north was attached to Burkina Faso at the time. So a lot of people, you know, kind of assimilated Burkinabe to be working with, rebellion at the time. So this is an important event, and in our MIDEQ research finding, we actually had some information that kind of corroborate what went on there. So in the quantitative data, we actually spoke to households in Burkina Faso. So the household that have a migrant in Côte d'Ivoire. So in the survey, we found that 35.68% of migrants in Côte d'Ivoire talk about their difficulties with their family back home. And in these difficulties, 28.03% evoke issues of xenophobia. That's the only data that we have in the survey that address directly xenophobia. But the qualitative data, of course, so the qualitative data gave more information about the experiences. Basically, we talked to returned migrants. I think someone mentioned it in the last session. So we actually talked with the returned migrant, and we asked them about their experiences, and we asked them to reflect on their migration in Côte d'Ivoire. So a lot of them actually, I'm giving some verbatim here about their experience. Given the time, I will just read a few, or you can read for yourself. But a lot of them are actually talking about the issues of xenophobia, like this one saying that migration is a search of gain and knowledge and can succeed or fail. Nowadays, Burkina Faso nationals in Côte d'Ivoire face a number of difficulties such as discrimination. This one is very powerful, from the 62-year-old farmer who said that one evening when we returned to our sleeping place, we found that they had shot 3 people and left them in the place where we sat to eat. So these are very powerful testimonies of these people that really experienced a lot of trauma, basically, during these crises. And also, given the crisis, there were also new laws like the resident permit that has been established. So the resident permit, as this farmer is saying, was issued when we were in Côte d'Ivoire. If you haven't been able to get your card, you will pay 6 CFA. And if they cut you, you were made to put your feet on the wall, your head down and feet up. So they are basically talking and reflecting about around what they really experience in Côte d'Ivoire, and some of them are very much traumatized. And when you talk to them about Côte d'Ivoire, they will discourage anyone to go there because they were really traumatized by the experience. Okay, so I can share the slide if you want, so you can see what a lot of people said. But for the 1 minute I have, I just wanted to highlight a very important point for me here is the current context in Burkina Faso, because as a lot of you know, is the epicenter of terrorism like the currently in Sahel, and we have 2 million IDPs in the country and a rising number of asylum seekers in neighboring countries, and especially in Côte d'Ivoire. So UNHCR estimates that Côte d'Ivoire hosts a little bit more than 31,000 refugees from Burkina Faso, and host sites are built in the northern part of the country to assist refugees. However, and I want to stress that given the context of and the history of the two countries, we can be worried of what can happen if the terrorist attacks that is basically spreading towards the coastal parts. If this terrorism is spreading and the number of attacks rose, you can also assist on, another kind of xenophobic attacks towards these refugees that are already fleeing a conflict in their country. So it's a situation that should be watched to prevent future xenophobic surges, and not only in Côte d'Ivoire, but also in the whole region. So thank you very much, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a round of applause coming your way then, so we can continue it. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I'm sorry. I want you to listen to much more of it. I'm just conscious of the time. But I mean, even in that short amount of time, you really showed, and there's the rest of the team, showed very clearly the importance of context, both historical context and contemporary context, and the way in which these kind of, and the context of colonialism, of course, and the way in which that creates certain kinds of narratives that then get perpetuated, but also moved us away from this idea of racism and xenophobia being a black-white issue. I mean, this is communities that are from potentially the same ethnic groups, same religion, same language, and yet, because of this construction of the inequality and the kind of politicization of identity in this context, we see these very powerful differences. So I think it was a short time, but it was a very useful contribution, and we'll certainly come back to you, I'm sure, when we get to the discussion points. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now to Carolina. Carolina Hernandez is advisor on migration and human rights at OHCHR, one of MIDEQ's partners, and a lawyer and political scientist by background. I say that just to sort of demonstrate the multidisciplinary nature of the project. So Carolina, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the ways in which the sort of racism and xenophobia that we've heard from Alexandra, how it impacts on migrants based on the work that OHCHR does, and perhaps also provide us with the kinds of, some ideas about the kinds of things that are happening to try and address this kind of racism and xenophobia, and how it perhaps varies by context. You've also got 10 minutes, and I'm also going to be vicious. Thank you.
On behalf of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, I do want to thank MIDEQ and UNCU Center for Policy Research for their collaboration in organizing this session. And really, congratulations for this symposium. And I want to invite everyone to have a look at the report. It's wonderful. It's been a very interesting and insightful day. And particularly, thank you, Heaven, with whom we've been engaging for many years on issues regarding racism, xenophobia, anti-migrant narratives. So as we collectively seek ways and tools and potential partners to combat harmful narratives regarding migrants and migration, I cannot start without reminding us all that migrants are human beings, and that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights without discrimination. And this is an important point to make, as this year marks the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and within it, the recognition that every human being, every person on the move, every migrant is free and equal in dignity and rights, wherever or whomever they are. Yet, as you mentioned, and colleagues throughout the day and in this panel will be touching on, migrants worldwide continue to endure various forms of discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Such hostilities exacerbate human rights challenges they already face in countries of origin, in transit, and at destination. Discrimination is not only one of the root causes of migration, but also impacts the lives of migrants and of their families throughout their journey. OHCHR has long been concerned about the impact of harmful narratives on the human rights of migrants and of societies at large, and we're delighted to be partner in MIDEQ and seeing how we can work together on this specific work stream on anti-migrant narratives. When we talk about harmful narratives, we're referring here to stories, to visuals, to messages on migration that either depict migrants as threats, associating them with crises or problems, or that reduce them to helpless victims or mere numbers in statistics. This ultimately reinforce stereotypes, fears, and anxieties of, quote unquote, the other. And these narratives in turn lead to policy choices that are hostile to migrants and minorities associated with migration, denying them their human rights. So it is crucial to recognize that the more these messages and images are disseminated, the more a narrative becomes normalized and accepted as common sense. This normalization makes it even harder to question and to challenge how migration is portrayed. So if we want to address systemic exclusion and governance issues effectively, it is imperative not only that we scrutinize laws and policies, but also to critically reflect on the way we perceive and communicate about this issue. OHCHR has been actively engaging on migration narrative change through our hashtag Stand Up for Migrants campaign, which seeks to reshape harmful narratives, to protect migrants' human rights, and to foster inclusive societies. And here what we have done is, instead of directly confronting these narratives, our approach has sought to complicate them by diversifying the stories we tell about migration. So what we have aimed to do within this campaign has looked or has been founded on three pillars. First, we have actively involved migrants to share their own stories, to have migrant voices, offering representation and nuance to the discourse. Beyond why and how they move, which is certainly very important, we have aimed to hear from migrants about their struggles, their hopes, their dreams, to help people realize what we all actually have more in common than what divides us. It is thus an important way to challenge devices us versus them messages. Second, we critically analyze why migrants are unjustly blamed and scapegoated for societal issues. Understanding these concerns often reveal that they stem from people feeling left behind, unfair systems, corruption, lack of representation, or being unable to influence policies, issues that are often unrelated to migration. And third, we raise awareness to ensure that we do not unintentionally reinforce harmful narratives. This involves avoiding language and imagery that perpetuates stigma and stereotypes, and instead opting for language and visuals that respect migrants' dignity and humanity. The campaign is founded basically on narratives of hope and shared values, and I do want to invite you all to visit the website where we have a number of resources that we have been compiling, including our 7 elements on building human rights-based migration narratives, our toolbox on migration narrative change, and a number of other tools. You mentioned a few very interesting initiatives today, Heaven, and we'll be looking at those with great interest. We also have, for instance, a cookbook with stories of a woman migrant chef, a series of podcasts, comics, animations, a number of other tools that I invite you all to visit. So as we work to reshape narratives, it is essential to engage with individuals who are not traditionally seen as allies. Research has shown us that those who are strongly opposed to migration represent a minority in most contexts. The majority of people are not vehemently opposed to migration. For instance, and I do want to share an example of the research that has been taken by our office, in particular our office at the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, who has carried out interesting research on public attitudes of migrants and migration. with the aim to contextualize our campaign efforts in a region with Australia and Malaysia serving as pilot countries. And the findings were illuminating. If we consider within a spectrum of attitudes toward migration, going from anti-migrant sentiments to fervent migrant champions, and including a persuadable middle comprising hesitant skeptics, supporters, and sympathizers, the research uncovered valuable insights. In Australia, only 14% of individuals aligned with the anti-migrant side of the spectrum, while noteworthy 29% stood as champions of migrants' human rights. In Malaysia, a similar pattern emerged with 60% on each end of the spectrum. This means that a significant majority, meaning 57% in Australia and 68% in Malaysia, reside in this persuadable middle. In essence, this means that most people have the potential to become supporters of migrants' human rights when approached with messages that resonate with their values. So to effectively engage with this persuadable audience on the undecided middle, we delved into their values, their preferred communication channels or platforms, and their message preferences. And based on this insight, we launched campaigns in both countries, Migrate Campaign Story in Australia and the Dari Dapur campaign in Malaysia, with videos, a video series where well-known figures from various fields, so including arts, music, cooking, entertainment, engage in heartfelt conversations over food with migrants and with individuals with migration backgrounds. And through these dialogues, they shared personal stories and uncovered commonalities. So the post-campaign survey in Australia, and I'll be very brief, revealed remarkable positive outcomes. An impressive 56% of the target audience reported that their support for migrants and migration increased after engaging with the campaign content. Over 72% expressed newfound confidence in discussing topics related to migration with their families and friends after watching the campaign videos, which is an impressive increase from the pre-campaign figure of 28%. And astonishingly, 88% of respondents indicated a heightened likelihood of engaging with topics concerning migration and migrants' rights. We're currently finalizing a methodology publication that outlines the steps taken in developing these campaigns, along with key findings from the research. This will intend precisely to assist partners interested in embarking in similar public engagement campaigns, ultimately to foster broader support for human rights-based narratives on migration. And our sincere hope is that more individuals and organizations, that as we're doing today, will join us in building a big tent to advance human rights and hope-based narratives on migration and migrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's always a pleasure to work with OHCHR, not least because you always start with this really important reminder that migrants are rights holders. They're not sort of, just victims who should be given rights if people feel like they're in the mood for it. It's very much a rights holder's perspective, and I think that's a really important starting point. I think the work on the polling is very interesting because, of course, that's also now the case in Europe, that the polling is showing very clearly that people are not vehemently anti-migrant. In fact, they've become much more positive over the last 5 years, I would say. And so what you're finding elsewhere is definitely a part of a broader trend. And I think we will want all of those links off you to the various initiatives that you're involved in, because I think there's a lot of cross-learning here that we can do. And we are intending to write up something after today, and we'll definitely want to include those links. And I think it's really often about, as you say, creating possibilities for people to come together as human beings and understand those commonalities. And I think the final point, and it links very nicely to our next speaker, is around this idea of, narratives that represent migrants as either threats or as victims. And somehow, that is very much reinforcing the stereotypes that people have already of migrants, and complicating those narratives is very much what we're all about in MIDEQ. So thank you very much for that contribution. And I'm sure we will come back to you in the Q&A session. And a reminder, particularly for those online, to put their questions in the Q&A box. So, Ben, we are moving on to this very question of how you navigate and how you represent, I guess, different complicated narratives that we are exploring in MIDEQ. Ben Werko-Dix is the founding director of Positive Negatives, which works to amplify research through engaging visual storytelling methodologies. And Positive Negatives is MIDEQ's animation partner. I always say that, and then I think it's much more actually than that, because we've really expanded our collaboration to include all sorts of other outputs and products that go beyond the animations themselves. We've already got 3 animations, the latest of which was launched in Rio 10 days ago, and which I understand we're going to have the pleasure to see again today. Yeah. Perfect timing in the day. Ben, I was wondering, I mean, I don't know the order of how you want to come at this particular topic, but I think what we'd really like to know about is about this idea of how we get more humanized and sort of rights-based migration narratives. And specifically, I guess, from your own work with MIDEQ, the challenges of navigating the kind of migrant as victim, but also migrant with agency type complexities that we're very much familiar with. So over to you. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heaven, and thank you.
Mic on, please.
There we go. It's off again. Thanks to Heaven and to all the parties for inviting me today. And it's a real pleasure to be presenting our film Unstoppable Beat here today and talking about the production and the choices that we made to create these migration narratives. And I think to answer your question, like the challenge that we have often is to work with policymakers, to work with researchers who, you know, you do like to use words. You do like to give me pages and pages of work and then want a 5-minute animation. And the animation that I'm about to show you, the script is 562 words. So that is my main challenge of how do I shrink everything that we've been speaking about today, which are hugely important global issues, and bring it into 562 words that is engaging and hopefully leaves an impact. And you'll be the judge of that. So I think I'll talk about it a bit more after the film. But to give you some idea about our work, this took about 16 months to produce, from conception of an idea to launching it 10 days ago in Rio. And the reason why it took so long was if we were just to write a piece of fiction and produce an animation, it would take about 3 months. But it takes 16 months because we collaborate with all of our partners. And I'm looking at Tony from Haiti, Heaven as the director of MIDEQ, Anita from Nepal, who I work very closely with. And it's about working with experts, with researchers who can continuously talk to respondents, to people, to communities, to individuals, to get their stories so that we can turn those and adapt those into scripts that hopefully bring out not the general kind of media negative stereotypes of migrants and migration, and also not to patronize by making it these extraordinary people, but just bringing out the lived experience. And that's what we tried to show with this film, Unstoppable Beat. So I think I'll play the film. I'm going to dim the lights because I quite like watching films with no lights, and enjoy, and we'll talk about it afterwards.
Every culture, every person, every life has its own rhythm. This is mine. I grew up in Port-au-Prince in Haiti. Many years ago, my people were enslaved, shredded, and shipped around the world. But our spirit never stopped beating. Our ancestors came together, led a revolution, and won our freedom from France as the first Black Republic. Since then, we've faced many challenges. France hit us with reparations, taking the fruits of our labor, and guns flooding from abroad into the hands of gangs. But whatever the world's thrown at us, we've always found a way forward. My own journey began in 2010. A big earthquake struck, and that wasn't the only thing that shook our country. International agencies came to help us, but some ended up harming us. And with political oppression and violence, there was lots of fighting and little work. If I wanted to earn enough to give my children a better life, I needed to find another way. I'd seen Brazil on TV, and I hope I could find work there. So I left my family and flew to Rio. But for a Haitian in Brazil, life moves to a different beat. Different attitudes, different goals, and different language. Every day I work tirelessly to build a new life, but I keep hearing the same word: no. No, you can't work here. No, you can't buy a house. And most of all, no, without the right paperwork, you can't bring your kids. Where are my rights? I have to keep fighting for them. I miss my kids so much. When I think of them, my heart races. I call when I can. If the internet's working, I can see them, but I can't hug them. For that, I need a visa. But getting one is not easy. You can't submit your papers online. You can't book an appointment. If you don't know the right people, you're just supposed to wait 4 months or years. But I'll never give up, because I know I'm not alone. We are not alone. There are thousands like me who share the same goal, the same passion, the same spirit. We dance to the same beat. If I can't find a way alone, we'll do it together. Come together, work together, even charter a plane together. Our beat cannot be stopped, cannot be ignored. We won't rest until we win our fights for the rights to live a decent life, so our families' hearts can beat together again as one.
So I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. Sorry, it seemed a bit staggered in certain areas, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I just particularly again want to thank Heaven and Tony for their invaluable support and insight into helping us produce that. And I really feel a great responsibility to produce these narratives. I've been doing it for about 10 years now. And like I said before the film, you know, there's a very fine line between, you know, continuing the media narrative of portraying migration with an often negative view, but then also not going too far into the positive and creating these extraordinary events, but showing the power and resilience and agency of people and communities. So today we've heard many experiences of migration issues, and what's really important for our roles as storytellers is to listen to the researchers who are the experts. I'm not an expert on migration. I work with teams and turn their stories into these animations and comics. And in Unstoppable Beat, the film you've just seen, there were so many experiences there that we wanted to touch upon, but within the scope of the film, to create a 5 or 10 minute film, you really have to, one of the challenges is to narrow it down. And listening to all of the talks today, there was almost everything I'm kind of eager to do a film on, but they're all individual films. If you try and put it all into one film, it becomes unwatchable. And so what we try to touch on here, you know, is some really big topics of, you know, we touched on the history of Haiti and to the present day struggles. We touched on the experiences of the male migrant making the journey and the decision making of leaving their home and traveling to Brazil. And that's something that Tony was talking about in her talk, of it's often the man that will make that first journey and then through family reunification bring over wife and children. The xenophobic and sometimes racist issues that Haitians deal with in Brazil, not being able to rent a house, get a decent job, being able to reunite with their family. And so working with our partners, we bring in the symbols, and they're things that I would have completely missed. And I don't know if any of you saw it, but there were symbols on top of the drum there. And these are voodoo symbols that are the first symbol that evokes the spirit of voodoo as you go through these ceremonies. I think that's right. And these are things that quite often are overseen by us audience, but for a Haitian audience, they'll see that and resonate with it. And it means something. It's a powerful force to get that visual material in there. And then the licensing and production of Haitian music. So as much as we can, we work with communities, whether they're musicians or voiceover or artists, to produce this work. And why I choose animation and why I think that's so powerful is that it allows us to tell these narratives that are often very sensitive, but many people have security issues and therefore they give them anonymity. And it's something that Ambassador Stevens spoke about in the last session, where she was talking about these women who are trafficked to the Gulf and experience huge issues there. And in Addis Ababa, I interviewed a young Ethiopian woman who was learning to walk again after physical and sexual violence she experienced as a domestic worker in the Gulf. And by turning her story into a comic, she was completely anonymized behind these illustrations. But we translated it into 8 languages and it went out onto the BBC, and her story was read over 12 million times in 5 days. And the ability to be able to send her messages from women all over the world who had said, I am you, I'm from Sri Lanka, I'm from Indonesia, this was my experience in the Gulf, in the Middle East, wherever, as a domestic worker, was incredibly powerful for her and her rehabilitation, to feel like she wasn't alone, that she was part of this group of women around the world. And so I think that the power of storytelling, of being able to take a film like that, and now we're working with educational developers to create a whole educational resources that go surrounding these films so that they can be taken into schools in the global north and the global south, and hopefully use your research and your policy papers and your research papers, but be able to package them into this kind of engaging and animations that will be able to engage students, the next generation, to understand this very, very complex issues that, you know, we sit here today and can all interact with, but many people can't. So it's one of the challenges is crossing that boundary to be able to get all of the stuff that we talk here today into audiences who aren't here today. And I think that's part of our role. Thank you. I think that's within time.
Thank you, Ben. I've been involved in that animation from the get-go, and it still really touches me. And it touches me more in a way because I know the process that was gone through to get there, and how the ending was different, and how we navigated some quite complicated discussions within MIDEQ about issues of representation and what was going to be foregrounded and what, you know, so it's not, as you say, 16 months. It takes a long time for a reason, but then what you end up with is this really, I think, beautiful and resonating for lots of different reasons, representation of a set of very complicated issues. So thank you for that. I don't doubt that we'll come back to you as well in the Q&A. We have one final speaker, last but not least at all. Ibrahima Guissé is a member and rapporteur on the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Ibrahima, we're very happy to have you here with us. And obviously there are a lot of policy and other rights-based approaches to try to address some of the issues of racism and xenophobia that we've been hearing about in this panel. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the work of the committee in particular, and whether there's anything that we can do or we can connect with to try and address some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like, dear participants, to thank and congratulate the organizers of this very important and interesting policy symposium for inviting CERD to take part in this day of reflection and sharing of experience on migration and inequality in the global south. As a researcher, please, I very much appreciate your analytical perspective, consisting in breaking away from the classic view that often focus on the South-North axis migration. I'm not going to say any more about this, because I myself experienced both perspectives, South-South migration and South-North migration. Let me tell that your research findings, much more, I was in research we conducted about 10 years ago, since that Kacha was in part of this research. So I'm speaking in my capacity of sir. In addition, please also allow me to note that this session 3 on racism, xenophobia, and migration narrative echoes our ongoing joint general recommendation project carried out by CERD and CMW. Now to start, please, I would say that in our world, the human mobility has been increasingly becoming a structural component due to numerous factors that you know, economic, labor, political, and many social dimensions. Societies are more culturally diverse than ever. It's very likely that this trend will continue in the decades to come in most countries in every region. Unfortunately, and while it's not a new phenomenon, racism and xenophobia has also been rising in many societies, impacting migrants, families, and communities in general in several aspects. Indeed, racism and xenophobia are intrinsically linked to human rights deprivation, namely to several means that lead to inequality, abuses, discrimination, exploitation, and other negative and actual outcomes from a right-based approach. Through narrative and representation of migrants and migration, and combined with them through different measures, practice, policies, procedures, and decisions, racism and xenophobia leads to human rights violation, either directly or indirectly, linking to various expressions. Basic human rights have been growingly restricted in the last decades due to nationality, migration status, and other related, including gender, race, socioeconomic condition, and other factors forbidden by the principle of non-discrimination. As you know, the mechanism of exclusion and discrimination based on race does not operate in isolation. It often acts alongside other forms of discrimination based on the status of being or being perceived as foreign. That is the definition of xenophobia. So, to try to answer the question that this session seeks to address, I would like to highlight the complexity of the links between racism, xenophobia, and development of negative narrative about migrants, the proliferation of hate speech. In this regard, 4 dimensions need to be considered in our analysis in order to understand how racism and xenophobia operate and why these practices of human rights violation persist. These dimensions are historical racism, institutional racism, structural racism, and also individual racism. First of all, what we may call historical racism. Historical racism involves the historical domination and subordination of certain groups, which continues to be reflected in legal, political, and institutional frameworks, language, and cultural outputs. As part of third country review, we have, for example, an important chapter entitled The Convention in the Domestic Legal Order and Institutional Framework. In this chapter, we look in particular at the demographic composition of the population, the application of the convention by the national court, and the legislative measures taken to prohibit racial discrimination. As part of institutional racism refers to the practice of social or political institution that results in the de facto exclusion of certain groups such as migrants. It is at this institutional level that racism and xenophobia feed, with xenophobic policies unfolding their negative effects. The third major challenge is structural racism or systemic racism. It should be noted that there is a fine line between so-called structural racism and institutional racism. Structural racism refers to exclusion in law or in practice of certain groups of individuals often belonging to ethnic minorities. When said, for example, review countries, just to call, instead we have a 3 sessions in April, in August, in November, December. The expert focused on uncovering practice, or what we can call on the blind spot, that are often part of structural racism through the situation of ethnic minorities in countries and the situation of migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, and also stateless people. For example, to try to answer your question, we often urge countries to take special measures in favor of certain groups. Also, we urge them to a political participation in public affairs by minorities. Also, measures to promote the language and culture of minority groups. Measures against the racial profiling and excessive use of force. The criminalization of irregular migration, respect of non-refoulement, and excessive use of force against migrants. Measures also to adopt a legal and institutional framework for asylum seekers and refugees. All these forms of a category of racism, historical, institutional, structural, are reflected in what we call individual racism, daily experiences by migrants. The individual racism takes many forms, including non-verbal behavior that undermines feeling of security and inhibit development potential. Physical violence, threats, intimidation, harassment, physical assault, damage to property, hate crimes, and hate speech. In the context of South-South migration, migrants particularly are exposed to physical and psychological violence, especially in the difficult political and social situation. They just become victims and scapegoats for the rhetoric of political leaders, which often leads to acts of violence, the destruction of migrants' property, and their collective deportation. The UN Special Rapporteur and Contemporary Form of Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Relative Intolerance proposed a definition according to which xenophobia denotes a behavior specifically based on the perception that the other is foreign to or originates from outside the community or nation. From this point of view, xenophobia exists when individual or group of individuals do not have the same rights as the rest of the population because of their real or perceived geographical origin, or when the values, beliefs, and practice attributed to them make them appear foreign. In general, xenophobia involves discrimination based on the perception of others as being foreign or not from one's community or nation. However, manifestation of xenophobia can occur against people of identical physical characteristics. That is a challenge. The Durban Declaration and Program of 2001 recognizes xenophobia as one of the main contemporary sources and forms of discrimination and conflicts, which requires urgent attention and prompt action by states as well as by international community. Moreover, while more and more societies are a clear reflection of the cultural diversity and humanity, among other factors due to humanity mobility, racism and xenophobia has become one of the major obstacles for achieving critical aspiration of the international community. Xenophobia leads to social conflicts and exclusion, to inequality and marginalization. The core objective of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the entire international human rights normative framework, as well as those assumed by states through key decisions as Global Compact on Migration, the Global Compact on Refugee, the 2000 Sustainable Development Goals, the Durban Declaration and Pan-African, can and will not be accomplished in a world where racism and xenophobia are on the rise and inform policies directed to the opposite direction of such fundamental and common goals. To conclude, please, the future, and by way providing some answer to the fourth question of the session, I would like to outline some concerns in relation to an ongoing project on migration and xenophobia. First, racism and xenophobia are today's major challenge to the respect, protection, and realization of migrant rights worldwide. Saying that means that there is a critical need to draw up authorities' guidelines for comprehensive public policies to combat xenophobia and its impact on the rights of all migrants, their family and society, in order to prevent and eradicate it in short term. Your fundings, tertiaries also your future work should help in this direction. Promote social and intercultural integration, promote social cohesion and intercultural integration of cultural diversity in the context of human mobility. What are the responsibilities of the state with regard to migration? It's important, unevidenced migration narrative, inclusive narrative, including all members of society as part of public policies to achieve social cohesion and moral development. Initiative to secure the commitment of political parties and other stakeholders to refrain from using xenophobia as political tool, example during election campaign. Xenophobia and the role of media. Measures to promote responsible treatment of migration by the media. Social responsibility of the media in preventing xenophobia and promoting intercultural integration in host society. The media as critical vector of integration, the risk of the media being vector of hatred, racism, xenophobia, social exclusion, and conflict. These are the thoughts that I would like to share with you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I think it's very helpful to have that framework, that institutional, structural and historical framework as a kind of hook on which to hang some of our analysis, actually, in terms of really trying to make sense, as Alexandra was trying to do, of how certain forms of racism and xenophobia manifest in different contexts. I think that's a very useful framework. I think your point about increased cultural diversity is also very relevant because, you know, the direction of travel in terms of diversity is very clear. You know, even if you take a country like the US, by 2045, it will be minority white. And so when we think about xenophobia, about being the other, as about perception as well as reality, if you like, of the perception of the other and the foreigner, this has implications for our societies as well as, you know, for migrants specifically, because all of our societies are changing. And even if you're not a migrant, you become, you know, stigmatized by this perception of otherness, which has implications for your ability to be part of society. So that's a very useful hook for us. Thank you very much for that. Okay, we have had all of our very excellent speakers. I'm sure you will agree. And now we have to task our discussant with trying to kind of pull together some threads, I guess, and also say a little bit about his own work and how this issue of racism and xenophobia impacts. David Oliver Yambio, I'm very, very delighted to have you with us, co-founded and spokesperson for refugees in Libya, first-hand experience of both being forced to leave South Sudan and seek protection, first in Libya and then now in Italy. David, I suppose the question is, what do you make of what you've heard today, not just in this panel, but I guess more generally? And also, can you tell us a little bit more about your own work with refugees in Libya to try and address some of these narratives from the perspective of those who are directly affected by them? You have 10 minutes. Thank you. If you put your microphone on. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much. It has been a very long day. Thanks to the organizer and also International Service for Human Rights for making sure that persons like me and self-organized movement like ours are present in spaces like this. Based on what I've heard today, I think it has been quite a lot, and it helps me to understand how things are happening on the table and what are the indifferences which it brings to what we experience on realities and on our bodies. Again, I will go with what he said, that I myself, I have experienced migration from south-south and then to south-north. But also at the same time, talking about migration and then racism, I would like to say that there is an in-country migration, because living in a country like South Sudan, where there is not only this internal conflict, which has been going for years, the chance or the ability to move from west of the country to go to the east of the country or south is where you find that there is racism, not only in foreign country, but within your own community, because who you are perceived of, because of the political indifferences which leaders are making institutionally. This is something I experienced as well during my time in South Sudan, and then having to migrate to reach in second host country as a refugee. This is where we face xenophobia, and then trying to understand the question that in which way that the racism and this xenophobic structure affect the potentials which refugees and migrants have. I think the first thing I would like to go to is what I call lack of recognition. The lack of recognition is something that relates to all aspects, to militias in the group, institutions that exist in the country, the common people that also are misled by the politicians and the political narratives that happens. This is where, when you are not recognized, you cannot have access to basic rights, as it is well articulated in this report I was looking at. We lack the ability to get included in the society, not to mention integration, because for us, affected communities like us, we see integration as something that is far away to be achieved. But when we are involved and we get included into society, we are able to showcase our talents, we are able to diversify ourselves with the local communities, and then to be able to challenge the political spaces for our own representation. This is something that we fight for. Then coming again to my engagement with refugees, not only refugees in Libya, but in the North African region, I myself, having experienced rejection, not only trying to migrate from south-south, but with the intention to reach Europe, it's where we are not talking about these complexity today. Mediterranean has one of the deadly migratory route. Since 2015, I think we have seen at least over 30,000 people that have lost their lives in this tragic journey, the perilous attempt to reach Europe, the rejection that they receive from the European border externalization, when it is enacting countries like Tunisia, like Libya, to act as a border guard in order to deter immigration. This is not only racism. This comes into structural and institutional lack of recognition and rejection to people who are seeking to such life. This is where I come to a point in which we talk about cultural identity, which pushes to psychological torture. For us, with our culture, in the communities where we find ourselves as migrants, and how we are perceived, or how the narratives are shown on the media by politicians, by different cultural groups, it does not only affect us, but it fights us mentally, psychologically, because you can't find yourself best situated into the society where you should be. At this point, what we try to do, again, with the migrant population, is to approach the common people, because it is very important for us to understand why we are not recognized in each of these communities, why we are perceived as invaders, for example, because these narratives is what pushes to racism and xenophobia, like what we see in Tunisia. A head of a state like Kais Saied Earlier this year in February, he came out with this great replacement conspiracy story against Black Africans who were residing in Tunisia. This includes people that I saw already, several names here, Egyptians, Burkinabe, that were living peacefully in the country. But after this speech, we saw that there was a complete xenophobic attack from house to house eviction of women, children being pushed to the Sahara Desert, not taking into the measure to approach organizations working in related fields of migration like the UNHCR, like IOM, to take strong measures to repatriate if there is any given need in such a society peacefully. But this was also something that was lacking in Tunisia, as an example. At this point, we have seen also that it has become racism and xenophobia pushes to the exploitation of migrants, as for example, Libya. Since 2017, migrants and refugees have become the hidden workforce to the Libyan economy, as again articulated by the Independent Fact-Finding Mission earlier this year, around March, on Libya. It was stated that there is crimes that have been committed against migrants and refugees, and it became a profitable mechanism both to the European institutions, Libyan heads of state, and the militia group that exploit migrants in the context of racism and xenophobia, which does not recognize them on both institutional level. What we try to do is, again, we try to empower ourselves to challenge the system. What we see here is where we started when in Libya. When we were full of this, we started to come together as people. What I saw here through the animation, that I found that the rejection I had received 4 times from Italy when being pushed back to Libya, I was not the only one. It was an experience of thousands of people. It was an experience of more than 30 different nationalities in Libya. The detention system that I was subjected to systematically 17 times, I was not the only one. What we did in 2021 was to come together, 6,000 people, to try to first approach the local community to understand what is happening, and the institutions. Why does our recognition only apply on the paper, but when it comes to the delivery of services, to the deliveries of jobs and recognition on certain levels, we are not available. And at the same time, we had to challenge institutions, governmental and non-governmental institutions like the UNHCR, IOM, who have been the champions managing immigration. At this point, we felt that we were limited because whoever wants to migrate today to come to the global north, you either has to go through the visa procedures, which is not accessible to so many population, not to mention countries like Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Sudan, sub-Sahara countries like Eritrea, that doesn't have access to documentation, because when you don't have documentation, passport, national identity, you cannot move at all to the other border. At this point, it was necessary for us to start questioning these institutions, how we can better get involved into the system, and to remind institutions like the UNHCR why the 1951 Geneva Convention was formed and why we felt that the system was already hijacked. By coming together as multiple and diversified communities from different nationalities, we were able to form ourselves, and for the first time in Libya and in the North African region, we were able to sit and negotiate with the Libyan Authority, with the North African authorities, to advocate against arbitrary detention and the closure of detention center, which is a wide practice in the North African region. At the same time, we were able to sit and negotiate again with the European heads of state to understand the migration policies. When migration policies are designed, persons like me who had to leave my country, not with the intention to cross the Mediterranean on a rubber-dingy boat, but circumstances which had pushed me, I am not always there to understand the policies, in which way that these policies should be defined. If I am a migrant who want to migrate, how should it be defined? Today, most of the things, just to answer the question briefly, most of the things that we do is, as people, we try to tell our stories. We try to approach local community. We try to approach local initiatives because we have lost hope in politicians. We have lost hope in the existing mechanisms like IOM, UNHCR, because we don't understand the process. We don't understand how they are driving the migration narratives. At this point, today here in Europe and beyond that Mediterranean Sea in North African regions, we try to work on what is safe migration, both starting in countries of origin, transit countries, and countries of destinations. And here in Europe, we have seen that different institutions are already working towards these mechanisms like CUNO, that when they involve us in these practices, trying to understand what is a way of safe migration, we are able to understand the practices. So just to end, what we do as refugees again, we try to document, because we see that today institutions doesn't really document what is happening. And once it's being documented, institutions globally recognized does not show footages, videos like this. They say that it is graphic and it is not supposed to be seen by common people. What we try to do is we try to visualize these incidents, the scenarios that we experience, to reach both host communities and countries of origin and then the transit countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for a very important contribution to this panel. I mean, I think your point about lack of recognition and rejection, I think those are such important words in this, because often when we talk about rights, we end up reducing it down to sort of access to services and discrimination. This is about identity and being recognized as fully human, right? Which is really at the center of what we're, I guess, trying to do. I think the material consequences that you highlight are also, of course, very critical, not least through deaths in the Mediterranean and elsewhere that are undocumented, and of course, the detention that you yourself personally experienced. But then you used a phrase, which was the phrase in the animation, come together, work together, and the sorts of things that you're doing to sort of mobilize around some of these issues within the community. I think these are very critical steps, because frankly, at this point of time, given the political narratives that we're often grappling with, it's not going to come from the top down, that's for sure. So I think, you know, mobilizing from the bottom up, using our data, working together collectively across our different areas of interest, and bringing all of these different, you know, sets of skills and knowledges and contacts into contact with one another, that's where we get our collective power, essentially. So I'm really, really grateful to you for being here to make that contribution. Thank you.